One fairly straightforward answer to the question, what even is a website today, is that a website is a digital interface for content in various forms. It's a system for displaying and distributing knowledge. In this way, not much has changed about websites since the dawn of the internet. Our tools for building those systems and structuring that knowledge have proliferated, but the purpose has remained the same. Now, there's a reason that Google's early mission was, quote, to organize the world's information and make it universally accessible and useful. The internet represents an incredible acceleration of the democratization of knowledge, a process also marked by the inventions of writing, the printing press, and the telegraph. Websites have allowed us to share not only empirical and rational knowledge, but also experiential, cultural, indigenous, and artistic knowledge. Even if it's sometimes hard to believe, we know more about each other and our diverse experiences of the world than at any other time in human history. And for some, that's a problem. Because knowledge is, at least in part, power. Whoever gets to curate and distribute knowledge has the power to shape how we see each other and the world. Now, if you're a regular listener of this podcast, what I choose to think and podcast about influences, in one way or another, how you perceive other ideas you come into contact with, how I set up a website and what aspects of my body of work I choose to surface shape how you interact with the knowledge contained within it. And that's quite a responsibility, and one I take very seriously. I'm Tara McMullen, and this is What Works, the show that rethinks work, business, and leadership for the 21st century economy. Today, I'm going to take that mission of rethinking things quite literally, because I want to talk about knowledge. One way to see the current attacks on inclusion, feminism, accessibility, and gender is as an attack on forms of knowledge and ways of knowing that threaten the social hierarchy preferred by those in power. And the lowly website can be an excellent way to fight back. In the first half of this episode, you'll hear my analysis of current events through the lens of epistemic violence. That is, the attack on knowledge. Then in the second half, you'll hear a piece I wrote last year that examines the push for artificial intelligence as a push to sort of de-skill the way we think as well as the way we work. Part 1. Knowledge is power. When Congress passed the bipartisan TikTok ban, one of the body's stated concerns was the potential for the Chinese government to manipulate the content the app showed to users. Later, in front of the Supreme Court, rockstar Solicitor General Elizabeth Prelogar repeated this concern on the government's behalf, albeit with a little less conviction than the national security concerns that also justified the ban in Washington's view. But it wasn't until TikTok went dark for about 18 hours as the ban took effect that there was an undeniable manipulation of the content users saw. The first instance was the message users received when they pulled up the app during its time offline.
Americans trying to use the video streaming app after last night now see this message, which reads in part, "We are fortunate that President Trump has indicated that he will work with us on a solution to reinstate TikTok once he takes office. Please stay tuned."
Here's the thing. The legislation did not require TikTok to make its services unavailable. Instead, it prohibited U.S. app stores from distributing or providing updates for the app. In the end, the effect would be the same. TikTok would eventually become unusable. But the technical difference is key to understanding how this was an instance of content manipulation. In this case, the content was TikTok's message itself. The next day, when I noticed the news that TikTok would be coming back online, my daughter opened the app on her phone. And now there was a new pop-up, a new piece of content. It read, "Welcome back. Thanks for your patience and support. As a result of President Trump's efforts, TikTok is back in the US." I rolled my eyes at the pop-up, as did my daughter, but I started yelling and wildly gesticulating when her first video popped up. It was a TikToker dancing around, also thanking the not yet president for saving TikTok. Now, I don't know if TikTok actually manipulated their feed to put that type of video in front of its users, but I do know there is nothing about her viewing habits that would lead her to seeing pro-Trump content. By taking the service offline, TikTok created an opportunity to praise the man who was not yet president. The TikTok team spotted a chance to perform an unprecedented act of flattery, because he who controls the pop-ups has the power. That message, seen by millions of Americans, shaped the experience of getting back on their beloved app. The message influenced those users as knowers. A pop-up message is a potent medium of communication, and its content delivers knowledge in a disruptive and authoritative way. This is old news now, though. The TikTok ban and Inauguration Day feel like a decade ago, even though nary a month has passed. Today's news is more about other forms of content manipulation. On the one hand, there's the systematic, if imprecise, purging of government web pages that include terms like pronouns, bias, or inclusion. On the other hand, there's the defunding of scientific research and the denial of access to critical databases of worldwide import. Of course, there is also the reckless handling of our most private data, not only putting it at risk of destruction, but making it an easy target for nefarious actors. This is on top of the ongoing and escalating attack on higher education. From questioning the economic value of the humanities, to raging against critical race theory, gender studies, and Marxist philosophy, to ending affirmative action programs, to now unceremoniously denying government funding to researchers who produce knowledge products and discoveries that benefit everyone, MAGA and its adjacent movements are fighting for ignorance. Beginning in the 80s, a college education was gradually transformed into a career training scheme and investment product. The college degree no longer symbolized an advanced education, but instead a commodified certification for a particular category of work. Of course, content manipulation is absolutely not new. When a council of Christian bishops affirmed what scripture was regarded as canon and what was apocryphal in 393 CE, they chose what Christian spiritual content counted and what didn't. When the US government forcibly removed Native children from their homes and put them in boarding schools, they chose what cultural content counted and what didn't. When radio stations took payments from record companies to play certain songs, they chose what musical content counted and what didn't. And we do this too. When I made decisions about what content to move from my various websites into the new consolidated one, I chose what of my own content I wanted to make accessible or not. On one level or another, how we create, curate, and make content accessible speaks volumes about what we value. And what we value then filters the knowledge we can access and the ways of knowing we can utilize. For this reason, knowledge creation, curation, and accessibility are powerful tools. Or perhaps more accurately, tools of power. When those with power declare some forms of knowledge unsuitable, worthless, unserious, or even offensive, the powerful declare their superiority to those who value them. This is a key aspect of colonialism. Frantz Fanon, a French Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist and philosopher, wrote that, quote, Colonialism is a psychic and epistemological process as much as a material one. What he was saying is that process of colonizing is as much about colonizing the mind and the system of knowledge of a people as it is about who owns what land and who works for who. Sociologist Annabelle Quijano, building on Fanon's work, describes the coloniality of knowledge as a process of superseding or erasing the knowledge and ways of knowing of colonized peoples. That erasure of knowledge and denial of ways of knowing destabilizes communities and disrupts the social connections that could be vectors for resistance. Epistemic violence works in more profound and, in a way, more destructive ways than physical violence. The Trump administration is erasing the language of feminism, diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility from government websites because that language represents a body of knowledge that threatens the hegemony of white male supremacist knowing. They demand people use and appreciate their sex assigned at birth because the lived experience of gender is a form of knowledge that undermines their authority. They insist on patriotic education in public schools because learning history is messy and requires a student to engage in ways of knowledge and learning that over time can threaten the status quo. They defund research, attack universities, and callously ignore the student loan crisis because our higher education system is defined by the expansion of knowledge. The political situation in the US and in many countries worldwide may seem to have little to do with your daily work. It may also feel all too salient. However, epistemic violence impacts all of us, right down to our bank accounts. In a particularly close-to-home example, Yellow House Media actually lost an in-progress production project to the National Science Foundation funding freeze. The NSF was funding a project that was funding our client, who was funding us, in a manner of speaking. And I'd like to say that this is quite an anomaly for us, and in some ways it is. But most of our clients leverage ways of knowing and forms of knowledge currently under direct attack. Now, I don't tell you this because I want to portray our little business as a victim. My point is that when knowledge comes under attack, when content is manipulated to privilege some and undermine others, when seemingly inconsequential decisions are weaponized, we all suffer. Knowing that, we can fortify the ways of knowing we value and the knowledge they create. We can learn something from the indigenous archivists and cultural stewards who work to restore ways of knowing and maintain knowledge. We can tell our stories, share the wisdom we gain, and document the diverse forms of knowledge we all possess. And one way we do that today is through websites. A website is a kind of archive. The content we create and the knowledge we share on websites are forms of preservation if we allow them to be. We've already seen how quickly platform executives are willing to betray us. So we can't rely on platforms as archives of knowledge, culture, or even social connection. But we can build websites. Part 2, Black Box Thinking. Just about every app I use has added quote-unquote helpful AI features in the last year. Canva wants to wave a magic wand at my designs. Descript would like to select clips and suggest titles for my podcast. Zoom wants to summarize my meetings, and Chrome would like to sort my tabs for me, among a lot of other things. Now, sometimes I find these features legitimately helpful. But more often than not, the proliferation of AI notifications and suggestions is just a distraction, an interruption in my flow. I'm not anti-artificial intelligence per se. I'm not even sure I'm all that upset about developers using my publicly available works in the training data for their models. I am interested in how AI will affect the workplace and job market, both the positives and the negatives. But right now, what I'm thinking about most when it comes to AI is how it's impacting the way we think. How could artificial intelligence limit our capacity for critical thinking? In what ways might it further erode trust in science or expertise? How will it shape our experience of truth in the years to come? Today's AI systems are often described as black boxes. Developers create a machine learning algorithm. They then feed the algorithm all manner of training data and then create a model that others can use. But how exactly the model does its thing isn't well understood. AI developers focus on the inputs and outputs. As long as they're getting what they want from the outputs, they let the machine do its work. Here's how Chloe Zhang put it in an article for Vice. Quote, "Rarely do we ever question the basic decisions we make in our everyday lives. But if we did, we might realize that we can't pinpoint the exact reasons for our preferences, emotions, and desires at any given moment. There's a similar problem in artificial intelligence. The people who develop AI are increasingly having problems explaining how it works and determining why it has the outputs it has." To Zhang's point, our everyday decisions aren't often the subject of philosophical self-inquiry. We don't interrogate what we choose to make for dinner or why we selected one pair of shoes over another. And that's fine, most of the time. As many of us have come to realize, our own black box thinking often hides cultural baggage that doesn't align with our stated beliefs or worldview. What our subconscious mind believes and what our conscious mind thinks it believes are often at odds. We know that our productivity shouldn't determine our sense of self-worth or that our personal struggles are symptoms of systemic problems. But we still get down on ourselves when we don't measure up to the bar our cultural conditioning set decades ago. Cultural conditioning shapes how we think and what we believe is true in ways that feel natural. We learn that's just the way it is, or that's just how the world works, to the point that we don't question it. We don't appreciate how common sense is really cultural knowledge that is learned and quite often full of bias or misinformation. The only way to disrupt that conditioning is to become conscious of it, examine it, and replace it with something truer. And maybe in this day and age, we need to think about technological conditioning too. Last year, Google launched AI overviews as a new feature at the top of some search results. AI overviews are similar to the snippets that have graced our more straightforward searches for years, but instead of pulling out, hopefully, relevant content from one source, the AI overview summarizes multiple sources. For instance, when I Googled Google Snippets history, an AI overview gave me a timeline and a few other facts with links to 4 sources. There's also a bit of fine print at the bottom to say that generative AI is experimental. Now, after Google rolled out AI overviews, plenty of people started to put the new feature through its paces. In one instance that went viral, a search for how to get the cheese to stick to a pizza resulted in the suggestion of adding some non-toxic glue to the sauce. This overview drew on a farcical Reddit post. Another, about the number of rocks one should eat each day, drew on some findings from none other than the satirical news site, The Onion. It's easy to say that any thinking person would dismiss these results as unfortunate errors, a glitch in an otherwise impressive matrix. But is the average or sophisticated searcher really a thinking person today? Do we approach search results with critical thinking or cognitive bias? How often do we accept the answers the almighty Google delivers so that we can get back to the task at hand? Our technological conditioning naturalizes the credibility of search results. After all, That's why search ads are so damn valuable. Instead of instigating healthy skepticism and critical examination, the black box engenders an odd credibility. We can't possibly understand how Google or any other app does what it does, so it must be doing it right. On the developer side, the black box represents a lack of knowledge or understanding. At the very least, it connotes hidden knowledge. However, on the user's side, the black box lends authority to the information it spits out. The black box doesn't prompt us to question so much as it prompts us to accept in a hurry and move on to the next task. If the machine says it, it must be true. That fine print warning at the bottom of the AI overview, generative AI is experimental, isn't really a caution at all. It offers developers plausible deniability while lending the future-focused, optimistic aura of experimental to the tool's output. We want to believe in the experimental. We want to believe that scientific innovation can help us solve real-world problems. And after decades of filtering the vast majority of our online activity through Google, we want to trust it. The black box creates the perfect conditions for what philosopher C.T. Nguyen calls hostile epistemology, or the way environmental features exploit our cognitive vulnerabilities. As artificial intelligence flirts with the unknowable, our mere organic intelligence must yield to sheer processing power. By occluding our view of the process by which an answer or suggestion is delivered, AI features also occlude our prompts to think critically about the answers they provide. As Nguyen puts it, quote, "We will only perform this error metabolism if we have access to the evidence of our errors. And that evidence can be hidden. If we are brought to trust and distrust wrongly, if we have been convinced to settle our minds in certain directions, then we can miss or dismiss the evidence of our error." We can't refute something we don't understand. We can't question the logic of an argument that doesn't show its work. We can easily perceive the black box environment and its experimental features as indicators of a superior intelligence, even a superior wisdom. We learn to defer to the black box because certainly it must know better than we do. When we learn to defer to the black box, we inadvertently become complicit in de-skilling how we think. In other words, our critical thinking skills atrophy. But de-skilling really is an apt word here, because it's the term of art in capitalist critique for cutting labor costs by changing the work to allow for hiring cheaper workers with less training, fewer expectations, and more reason to comply with management demands. A recent study led by Hank Lee of Carnegie Mellon University in partnership with Microsoft researchers found that, quote, "While Gen AI can improve worker efficiency, it can inhibit critical engagement with work and can potentially lead to long-term over-reliance on the tool and diminished skill for independent problem solving." Now, this is presented as a negative, but it's also worth considering whether it is more efficient, financially speaking, to employ workers who are less likely to notice and try to solve problems in the first place. Black box thinking isn't limited to our adoption of sort of the flashy artificial intelligence products. The Bezoses and Zuckerbergs of the world want us to trust their black box corporations. Banks want us to trust their black box money management. The Supreme Court wants us to trust its black box deliberations and backroom dealings. Black box thinking also runs amok on social media. The posts we see are the result of hidden processes. We imagine what those processes must be, what's inside the black box, and attempt to recreate the output and feedback others receive. For all these reasons, noticing and resisting black box thinking must be one of our chief priorities as we forge ahead into the future. We can't assume that what's unknown is credible, beneficent, or useful. We can't accept what we're told unless there's reasonable transparency in the process. Resisting black box thinking is a resource-intensive project. We're more vulnerable to epistemically hostile environments when we're trying to cut corners mentally and temporally. And while it's always been true that we need to be cautious about believing what we read on the internet, today we must devote extra resources and care to the information and suggestions we come across. In other words, we have a reason, yet again, to slow down, make space, and rethink our assumptions. Thanks for listening to What Works. As always, you can find a text version of this episode at whatworks.fyi, where you can also subscribe to get the What Works newsletter delivered straight to your inbox, free of charge. Plus, you can find out more about working with me to turn your own meaningful ideas into remarkable content. Today's episode was written, edited, and produced by me, Tara McMullen. What Works is a production of Yellow House Media, a boutique audio and video production studio that turns meaningful ideas into remarkable content. What Works is produced on the ancestral homeland of the Conestoga and Susquehannock people, and the Yellow House is located on the lands of the Salish and Kootenai peoples.